welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll return to one of my favorite subjects, which is history, and in particular, local history, things that go on here in Chicago. And our guest tonight is a public historian, Mr. Josh Eisenberg. Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Kevin, thank you for having me.
So that's a rather unusual title, public historian. What exactly is that?
That was originally my title when I worked at the Chicago History Museum back in the early 2000s, and it was a way to bring history out of the museum and to the wider public. I did a lot of programming, and then when I left the museum and returned later as a tour guide, it was a title that just seemed to fit the bill. It's not as intimidating. It doesn't make people think like, oh, they're
he's a serious academic.
Yeah, public historian makes it sound like, you know, I'm here to answer your questions. I'm here to bring history outside the museum and make it more part of how it relates to you.
So I think the complaint that most people have about history from their school studies is it's so dry and it's all those darn dates and who cares anyway. So what do you do to try to liven it up? How do you make it real for people?
I focus on the story part of history. I think that's the more important aspect that we always leave out. We do, for whatever reason, when we grow up, we are inundated with, no pun intended, inundated with dates. 1776 and 1861 and 1865 and 1918, and that is important. I still think
that's just American dates.
That's just American dates. I mean, 1066, I can throw in all sorts of fun dates. And context is important. It's important to know that the Civil War happened in the 1860s and didn't just happen sometime.
Right.
So, but at the same time, it's the stories that make it interesting, which is why people tell them. It's the stories that make people want to know. People aren't interested in the Chicago fire because it left 100,000 homeless. They're interested in the Chicago fire because it may or may not have involved a cow. Like, that's what makes the story interesting for people. It's things like that.
Well, it also changed the city dramatically. I mean, the city was very different after the fire.
Yes.
So if you think about, well, why is the city the way it is now? Why are building codes or something like that?
Right. The connections are the other aspect that is just fascinating. When I was younger, there used to be a show. It was on public television, but originated in Britain, called Connections. And
I remember watching that.
Yes. And the gentleman's name escapes me, who hosts it. And he would do these things where he would take this little thing. He's like, let me start with a cork. And by the time we end, he's like, let me show you how that relates to the space shuttle. And I think people find that very interesting, showing how the 1893 World's Fair actually hindered architectural evolution for decades because everyone loved the White Fair and the neoclassical style so much that Art Deco took probably an extra 20 years to get out there.
In fact, I think Frank Lloyd Wright said that that was one of the worst things that ever happened to architecture in America.
Yeah, was the White City. Oddly enough, it was his mentor who was the only one who tried to take it a different way, and he ended up penniless and drunk, and other architects had to raise money for his tombstone. But it's those connections that you relate to the kids who I deal a lot with, or teenagers, or even adults. It's amazing how many adults I meet who've grown up in and around Chicago, love the city, but don't know all the fun facts about the city. Like, they know the fire, they know Mrs. O'Leary, they know everyone knows Al Capone. It was one of the most popular people to call when we got calls internationally at the History Museum. It was either Oprah. This is pre-2008. So Oprah, Michael Jordan, or Al Capone. Those are the three most well-known Chicagoans up till President Obama was elected. So it's those stories and connections I try to make. Like, listen, we're going to start at point A, and look how it leads to Z. And that's what's, I think, interesting. And if you tell that, now again, you have to tell it well.
Yes.
It's not just, reading it from a script isn't going to help anybody, but it's those kind of things.
Well, so what's your experience in storytelling? I mean, there are, as I do, there are people who can tell a story just riveting fashion, and others who could bore you to death on your favorite topic. Yeah. So how do you learn storytelling? Or how did you learn?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I think part of it's how I've always remembered things. And the other thing is also, I think storytelling comes from a love of the story. Like, if you're enjoying a story, I don't care if you're talking to an economist and they have a great story that they're very excited about macroeconomics and how it affects Colombia, that story is going to be told differently than if I told it, even if I'm a great storyteller, because I don't have the love for that.
Right.
At the same time, I'm lucky enough to have had theater experience. I've done, public speaking for years, so I can figure out what you can filter out, what you need to put in, without changing the content. Like, that's the other thing. You never want to lie. Although tour guides are allowed to say at the beginning of any story, I do not know if this is true, but, and then you're allowed to say anything
Then
you
it's a
want.
great story. Well,
It doesn't matter.
Satchel Paige once famously said, never ruin a good story by sticking too close to the truth.
No, never. That's as the other day someone was like, don't let something similar about like it might be true, but it might be a yarn, but it doesn't really matter
Because it's a great story.
It's a great story. So, but I do. I mean, for obvious reasons, with the history tours, of course, I try to stick as close to the truth as possible. But it's finding the parts that you think would be most interesting to a broader audience. I have to remember what I find interesting as someone who would classify themselves as a history geek is not the same amount of interest that someone who's like, in town with their parents, they're in their 20s, they wanted to bring their parents on a tour to do something.
Right.
I got to hit that person at a different level than maybe their dad who's like, reads every label at the museum. And I can sit and have a
So how do you do that? I mean, that's a good question. So you got the guy with his dad,
Right.
and the dad might be a history geek,
Right.
and the kid's just there because he's going to school locally, and his
Right.
dad's in from out of town. And how do you tell the same story to hit both those people?
I think what I would do is, if I'll give an example of one of my favorite parts. I talk about the causes of the Great Chicago Fire. Obviously, there are several causes. It didn't just quite happen, but
And it wasn't necessarily Mrs. O'Leary's cow.
and it was not Mrs. O'Leary's cow. That was actually made up. The reporters admitted it was made up. And in 1994, the city of Chicago exonerated the cow through the city council because it's politics. It's always politics here. But you talk about what you do is, for me, it's a build-up. So if I'm talking about, like, if you are not into history and you hear the words, let me tell you the causes of blank, I mean, you shut down, because that's what
Right.
AP history tests are. Please list the causes of the Civil War and how that, please list the causes of the
Right.
Great Depression. So I'm going to talk about the causes of the Great Chicago Fire. It was hot and windy. I don't need to spend too much time on that because everyone will understand the meteorological standpoint there. But then you get in the fact that, like, by the way, Chicago was in the mud when it was founded. It was a swampland. As a matter of fact, the lake used to come up almost right to Lincoln Avenue in Lincoln Park, almost that far up. It was called, the Indian name for it was Stinky Onion. The cemetery, I mean, these are just facts you show to prove that, but all of a sudden it gets interesting. You're like, yes, it was so swampy and low-lying that they had to move the cemetery just north of North Avenue because when it rained really hard, Grandma
bodies
would
would
float
pop up.
away.
Right.
So one of the things they did is they literally lifted the city out of the mud. And to do that, they built wooden sidewalks. So you have hot and windy, you have wooden sidewalks. They built balloon frame houses, which are made of wood. Again, 2 seconds to tell that part. People understand that in their mind. And then the last part I'll mention is some wealthier areas of the city did not like the noise of wagon wheels on cobblestone. They found it very loud and annoying. So they asked that be taken care of. So it was by dipping blocks of wood in tar and laying a street with them.
Tar, which is highly flammable.
Highly flammable. So I then usually say something to the effect of, other than replacing the Chicago River with kerosene,
Right.
you've pretty much set this place to
be
blow.
a tinderbox.
It's a tinderbox. And it's that kind of thing where you're mixing and matching. I have the dad. The dad's there, he wants to be there. I've now gotten the son by sitting there and being like, okay, listen, I'm not just gonna sit there and be like, it was hot and windy.
Right.
It was, or it was really dry. I'm gonna sit there and be like, listen, it was dry, but you also have to remember. And then for like younger kids, I talk about the fact that during the fire, I said, anyone probably your generation and younger now knows that when there's a fire in your home, you leave. That's it. You maybe get what's next to you, but you leave. You don't sit there and be like, what do I need to take with me?
Right.
Back then, because things couldn't just be readily replaced, they tried to get everything.
And
So they would
trap
go in.
themselves.
Well, no, that was the funnier part is the fact that you get their like furniture, because again, it's handmade. There's not factories in the same way. Even in 1871, they're bringing it out. Their clothing, which again, you have to handmade, they're bringing that out. Pieces of fire that have these piles of clothes outside on the street, cinders would come and light the piles on fire. So you'd have entire streets catching fire. So it's these kind of things where kids, and I'm like, I mean, it's creating a visual picture of history, because there's so much history that we don't have.
Now, one of the most interesting visuals I have of the fire that I read recently was because of the wind and because of the balloon construction, that the roofs of the houses could be detached fairly easily. And because it was so windy, a roof that was on fire could get lifted up by the wind, spun like a frisbee, and might travel several blocks away.
Yes.
And so a flaming roof would suddenly pick up and land a couple blocks away in an area that might not be on fire yet.
Right.
But it was like firebombing the city or
Right.
firebombing the block.
There are stories of people seeing 6 to 8 foot pieces of 2x4 just floating because you would have the wind and then the convection of the fire wind.
Right.
It crossed the river 6 times. I mean, back.
In 6 different places.
Yeah,
right?
back and forth. So yeah, and that's again, the visuals are so important when you do history stuff because for a variety of reasons, even Chicago, which I think does, I mean, as much as people criticize it, does an actually decent job of protecting its history. There's not stuff around from 1871 very much.
There wasn't much left after the fire.
No, there wasn't much left. But I mean, there's very little to say. Here's, actually, it used to be great near the, on Astor Court, which is the only block in the city of Chicago where the entire block is a historic landmark. The Cardinal's Mansion, which is there, which used to be Chicago Catholic Cemetery. And then the Cardinal got named Cardinal for Chicago, and he built a mansion, and they moved the bodies north. Yeah. There used to be an alley that actually wasn't paved over, and you could see the blocks of wood dipped in tar.
Ah,
you could
still
see
there.
that. It was still there. They've covered it since, which is, I mean, I don't know how you say to the city, can you please just leave this gaping hole in the alley? But that's what happens. So you'd take people to a tour. It'd be great because you'd sit there and be like, listen, remember I talked about here. These are right here. And people are like,
That's
wow.
what it was, right?
Yeah, I mean, those are 140-year-old pieces of history right there staring at you.
Now, in Chicago, there are older neighborhoods still
Yes.
where the houses are actually, the sidewalk is at a higher level
Yes.
than the house.
Yes.
And this was part of the effort to raise the city up out of the
Yes,
mud
these
as
are
well, right?
these are the people who couldn't afford to. You know, like actually the man who made lots of his money raising the city was Pullman. That's how he made his money, was hiring people to jack buildings up.
Before he went into the railroad.
Before he went into the railroad thing, he got his money hiring people. There are lithographs, which are fantastic, of like 200 guys with like car jacks. They wouldn't be obviously, but car jacks, lifting buildings off and then putting in false basements. But if you were poor,
you couldn't afford
you
that.
couldn't afford that. So if you go to Bridgeport, parts of Chinatown, some of that area, yes, all of a sudden someone's first floor became their basement.
Right. And you can see that.
You can see it. I love putting it out now when I drive around with people, like not on a tour. If I'm with family, I'm like, you have to see this. The two things I love pointing out to people when we drive are that and servants' entrances in the Gold Coast. Like, see that? See that small door over there? That's where your servants had to go in.
Well, even in downtown Chicago, years ago when the tunnel system flooded, no one, very few people in Chicago knew that tunnel system even existed. And suddenly it was flooding the entire downtown area. Right? So these are the kinds of the hidden history, right? That can suddenly spring up and meet you face to face in the current world, right?
Well, and it's so funny because, I mean, again, I think people who, Chicago is such a small town feel. I grew up in New Jersey outside of New York City. There's nothing small town about New York City. Maybe some of the neighborhoods in Brooklyn, but I mean, if you're in Manhattan, you are in Manhattan. Like there's not. In Chicago, I literally run into people, which in a city of 3 million still blows me away at times. And I'm like, oh, there's, one day we were walking by the Tribune and my wife's like, I believe that's John Cass. And it was, and we said hi. And it's one of those funny things. But for such a small city, people forget it's still a city. And one of my favorite things to do is when I do my, they call them the Devil in the White City tours based on the Eric Larson book. We don't do much of the devil for obvious reasons, but the White City aspect is the Wooded Isle is still there. And it's overgrown slightly because it's been there, but the Wooded Isle, the artificial Wooded Isle built by Frederick Law Olmsted for the fair is still there, and you can walk over the bridge and you can go on it. In 1993, Osaka, Japan built a Japanese garden there. So in the middle of Chicago, in Hyde Park neighborhood,
is the Wooded Isle.
Is a Wooded Isle with an Osaka Japanese garden on it, a traditional Osaka Japanese garden isle, with one of the lanterns. Historians in the area believe that it actually has one of the lanterns left from the fair, from 140 years ago. One thing left from the fair on there.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's great, but like people, I mean, I've taken lifelong Chicagoans, and they're like,
well, I would know, I grew up here. I would know nothing about it.
You would have no idea, and that's when I love that part of the job. I love that part of the job to be not from a like haha, but more just like wow, look what you have, right? Or when I first moved here, we went to Museum of Science. You know, we were still tourists. My wife and I moved here. That's what you do when you first move to Chicago if you're not
any
from
city.
here. Any
Check
city.
it out.
If you're not from there, check it out. And I remember the first time I saw the Museum of Science and Industry, and I was like, I wonder why they flooded the backyard. And it took me until I read the Devil in the White City to be like, they didn't flood it. They built that on purpose. You would walk out the back and get in a gondola and go to the Wooded Isle, and that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And to get to the Wooded Isle, you have to cross the Clarence Darrow Bridge now, where they poured his ashes over the bridge when he died.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you can go there right now. And they hold a seance every March.
I have to go on these tours.
You do? I would be happy to have you on this tour.
Yeah, because this, as I say, I grew up in my family are longtime Chicagoans, and we're interested, not of formal historians, but we're very interested in the history of the city, and knew it, and knew the politics, and knew. My mother knew Bathhouse John.
Oh wow, really? That's awesome.
And so it's that sort of thing that I grew up with, and yet there's still so much that you don't know.
Right. And again, it's just, I also think Chicago is so wonderful for people wanting to know its history. Because as much as there's turnover in Chicago, obviously any major city is going to have turnover. LA is so new, and New York has so much turnover. I mean, that city is new. It feels like,
Well, New York is such a world center.
Yeah, it's just, it doesn't have the same.
It draws people from all over the globe.
Right.
And so
it
it
just
has a sense of being a local place.
Right. And Chicago, though, it's like, I mean, I have people on tour who can tell me what parish they grew up in. That's as identifiable as a neighborhood for some people. I have a friend, Joanne Bloom, who when I first met her doing tours, she was sitting there going you just ask me what parish they're from and I'll give you a better idea of what you need to know. I was like, okay.
And it's true. My family, being Catholic, of course, knew the entire city by the parishes.
Right.
What parish are you from? And that was, and it explained who you were. If you're from a certain parish, you were German. Another parish, you were Irish. It sort of explained a lot about your culture. So it was a central thing, and these were just, they weren't. It wasn't even the official city boundaries. This was a Catholic church that created the parishes.
And one of the sad things actually now is when you drive around to some of the old neighborhoods, you'll see all these Catholic churches, and so many of them are
boarded up,
or not being used in that way. Or what I do love is when they repurpose them. Like when you do find a Catholic church that's like, I'm using a bad example, but St. Alphonsus, but it now has Spanish masses. And you're like, oh, that was a German church that has gone completely over. But to me, that's great. That's Chicago.
Well, one of my favorite areas in Chicago, speaking of changing over and repurposing, is Devon Avenue.
Yes.
Now, I grew up in Rogers Park, so
wow.
when I was young, Devon Avenue was largely Jewish. And so there were delis, there were clothing stores, and over time, it became Russian. All the Russian immigrants came and moved into Devon Avenue. And then eventually they moved on to the various suburbs. And now it's Indian and Pakistani.
Yeah.
And what's intriguing is that the local Indian and Pakistani people say, well, if you go across the globe to India and Pakistan, they're at their nuclear-aimed missiles. They're at the edge of some sort of skirmish. And he said, but go to Devon Avenue, and they're right next door.
Right.
There's an Indian food store and a Pakistani clothing shop, and they're right next door, and they talk to each other, and they're neighbors, and they don't care, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting way to see the kind of evolving of a city neighborhood, and how different ethnicities change it and modify it and make it something continually new.
Yeah, and I love that about that. I mean, there's an aspect of it, especially because I think it's lost a little of the segregated feel it probably had in the 50s and 60s, where you went there because you almost were not allowed to go any other places. Now it's just communities building on communities, and it's just this great, like, if you are coming over from India and Pakistan, you know where you can go in Chicago to find food, to find people who speak your language, to find books to read, and
clothing
that's just
that you recognize.
Yeah, and the best is, a person getting off the airplane from Pakistan can stop a Chicagoan probably whose parents were Polish and came here 3 generations ago and say, I'm from Pakistan, and they would say Devon Avenue.
Yes.
Head on up, north side, Rogers Park.
Because people would know.
Right. It's fantastic.
So you've brought a book with you here, and this is The City of Scoundrels by Gary Christ. So this is not a book you've written.
No, I did not write this book. A gentleman, Gary Christ, who's written for a variety of publications. And I read this book this summer, and I'm offering a tour on City of Scoundrels for the Chicago History Museum.
Well, if you hold that up, we'll actually get a picture of that. Gary writes about the City of Scoundrels, but it's really, it's about much more than just that, right?
Yes, it's a great title. People with Chicago history are very good with titles. What this is it looks at pretty much a 2-week period in July 1919. And what it ends up doing is focusing on the race riots that occurred in Chicago, the deadly race riots.
And I'm willing to bet that most Chicagoans wouldn't know that there were race riots in 1919.
Right, or if they know, I mean, they know them vaguely as, I mean, even the Chicago History Museum, it's one portion of an exhibit. And you walk by it like, oh, there were race riots here in 1919, what's going on? He takes a fuller look at them. He takes a fuller look at what built up into them. He also takes a look at the race riots themselves, how the city reacted, and then the lasting impact following that. And then he surrounds that with stories of two of the major influences in Chicago history, politically, Big Bill Thompson, William Hale Thompson, who, by the way, had his own radio station, WHT in Chicago. Oh, really? William Hale Thompson. Yeah, I like that.
It's sort of like Berlusconi, own the media and own the town.
Yeah, exactly. It's brilliant. And Chicago did a really good job with all of its radio stations like that. World's greatest newspaper. So Big Bill Thompson, who's probably one of the most, if not the most corrupt mayor in the history of the city of Chicago, and also developed the political machine. The cross-sectional, cross-race, cross-ethnic political machine that, like, Anton Cermak first polished, and then the first Mayor Daley, like,
perfected
brilliantly. Like him or not, he did that well. So William Hale Thompson is a major figure in the book. And then the other major figure is someone who was rather well known, but I don't think one that people recognize the time she spent in Chicago, or, unfortunately, even the influence she had nationwide, which is Ida Wells Barnett, who is a anti-lynching activist, woman who grew up in Tennessee. She was a newspaper publisher for a period of time. She was an outspoken critic of the World's Fair because her big issue was all these different ethnic groups are here. They're all representative. Fiji, Japan, China, Africa. No American blacks were represented at the 1893 World's Fair.
Well, the American blacks were still largely invisible in society at that time.
Right, and she just thought it was very ironic that you'll invite tribes of Africa over and be like, hey, but like we have blacks all over the South Side, which, by the way, surrounded
the White City.
The White City, ironically.
But we're probably not particularly welcome inside the White City.
No, not particularly welcome. So she is very influential, and he pretty much does a great job of using those two individuals as kind of bookends. Not so much the beginning and the end as much as like framing the entire story of the race riots and her influence. And it's a great story that talks about those 2 weeks, the influence that would have later on in Chicago. Big Bill Thompson, he's actually best known for bringing Al Capone back to the city of Chicago in 1927. He had been pushed out to Cicero in 1923 under William Deaver, and when William Hale Thompson came back into power in 27, he said, I'm going to make it an open city.
And we hear that term, open city, and I've read that myself, and it really means pretty much anything goes. We're just going to look the other way. Everybody gets paid off in the right manner. Everybody gets their cut, and God forbid if you don't give the right cut to the right people, but as long as you play by those rules, anything goes.
Yes, right? Completely. And Capone was able to settle in and did his work until the early 30s, of course, when the feds finally got him.
For tax evasion.
For tax evasion, of course, because killing people you can get away with, not paying the government, that's a problem. So Big Bill Thompson's just a great, I mean, whether or not you like him, and he can be despicable, but he was also the first mayoral candidate and mayor in the city of Chicago to actually like recognize the black vote as existing and important in the city of Chicago. At one point, he actually made a statement early on in his electoral career that he's like, I'm tired of building parks for wealthy white people for their dogs. Black communities need parks. And like he campaigned and got that down there. Now he treated them very much like their votes he needed, but he didn't just disdainfully say they're not going to vote for anybody else but me, so who cares?
Right, he actually tried to do things for them and with them.
And this, of course, he was a Republican, and this was still early on, and when the Republicans and Lincoln were still
very closely
very tightly knit.
Now, one of the interesting things in history, and even we've seen this just recently with former Governor George Ryan, who went to jail, but that people are complex characters, and you see this in history that's of any real depth.
Right.
And here, Big Bill Thompson, who was one of the most corrupt politicians ever. But he was the first to reach out to the African-American community and try to make life better for them. George Ryan, who went to jail as a governor, but ended the death penalty. And so progressives think that he's wonderful for that.
Right.
So you get these historical characters that I think are so interesting because nobody's completely evil, nobody's completely good.
No.
You know, there's all this mix constantly.
And he did, I mean, Big Bill, I mean, he loved Chicago. He truly loved it. As a matter of fact, he was very much on a very similar track to Teddy Roosevelt early on. He was a cowboy. He went out to Wyoming. He was on a ranch, Thompson and Roosevelt, of course. And he came back. He was a very young politician. His dad was very involved in politics, and he kind of took on the mantle. Now, of course, we know where Roosevelt ended up. But honestly, for a lot of people, I mean, Daley, Cermak, Thompson, running the city of Chicago.
Richard J. Daley loved the city.
Loved running the city.
In fact, as you no doubt know, his complaint about Martin Luther King when he came to Chicago to lead the protest, Daley's reaction was, he don't even live here.
Right, he doesn't know the city. He
doesn't know the city.
Right.
What can he be doing here? He's not. So you know, Chicago is its own thing, and Daley treated it actually, and his son, I think, also treated the city as a family. Well, this will sound terrible, a family protectorate, but that the Daley family's primary role was to protect the city.
Right. For all the criticisms you might have of them, no one could argue their genuine love for the city of Chicago.
Right.
And whether or not they always did the right thing for the city, they thought they were doing the best thing for the city, which is not always the same.
Well, even today's mayor, Rahm Emanuel, has said it's the best job in the world.
Right.
He left the White House to
be
come and be the mayor of Chicago.
Well, and it's so funny, especially, and I think they're different. I mean, the lack of term limits. Again, growing up outside of New York, the mayor held a role, and I grew up under Mayor Koch. That was our big mayor. Ed Koch was the mayor I was first familiar with growing up in New Jersey, which again, New York is so big that in New Jersey you care who the mayor is.
Yeah, right.
Indiana, I'm sure, cares who the mayor is here. And David Dinkins and Rudy Giuliani, and mind you, they were all personalities, because you can't run a major city and not have some sort of personality. But because of term limits,
they had to.
You had 2 terms, and you were done.
Even Bloomberg stretched it to 3.
He had to stretch it, but he's done.
He's done.
I mean, it's 12 years. I mean, again, there are kids who grew up only knowing Mayor Daley and went to college only knowing the second Mayor Daley.
Right.
First Mayor Daley, for that matter. So Big Bill Thompson's a great character. I mean, there are great stories about him outside of this. I love the Kogan book.
So what do you do in the tour?
The tour is actually going to be, what we'll do is mainly focus a lot on locations of the riots and some of the other instances discussed in the book. So for the riots, we'll end up going to 23rd Street Beach, which is where the riots actually began. The beaches in Chicago were segregated.
As was everything else.
That was everything else. But sometimes I think people in the North, we get all like, oh, well, we
weren't the South.
We weren't the bad. No,
but
we segregated beaches. Right. And 3 black youths were on like a raft and floated into the white section of the beach. And they were stoned. And one kid fell off and was hit and drowned. And what was funny is not funny at all. What was odd and what was, looking back, tragic is the black youths argued with the white youths who had killed their friend and whatever, and the cops arrested the black youths. So, and that just started the whole thing. Mayor Daley, by the way, was likely in one of the gangs that was one of the heavy hitters early on in the race around Reagan's Colts. So he was probably pretty darn involved. As the Kennedy Expressway can show you how clearly he was involved in race issues in this city.
Well, we only have about a minute left.
I'm sorry, yes.
So in that minute,
yes.
Tell our viewers what it is that why should they come on these tours? What is that they'll walk away with? With
this tour, which is October 19th from 1 to 5 p.m., you will get a feeling for the city. You will get a feeling for the politics. You get to hear about a tragedy, a blimp crash in the middle of the loop, and it just brings to life a different time period that we forget about. 1919, I mean, it's after World War I, before World War II. Most people just remember the Black Sox, and I think it gives you an opportunity to fill in some of those gaps of Chicago history that are still influencing Chicago in 2013.
Can't think of a better way to sum it up than that. So, Josh, thank you so much for coming on our show, and I hope I'll have you back. The history never stops, right?
No, it does not.
We can talk about more later.
Great, Kevin. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and you can find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.